Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Passionate Talk. I am your host, Gary Karp, and this is episode number 15. Today we have part 3 of my conversation with Reenee Cummins. I hope that you've enjoyed the first 2 parts that we aired last week. If you haven't had an opportunity to listen to them, head on over to www.passionatetalk.com and just take a listen to them. They are fascinating conversations. You could also head on over to iTunes where you can download them and any of the other episodes. And also, please remember to hit the subscribe button and you'll get this podcast delivered to wherever you listen to podcasts. Now, today we're going to talk to Reenee about the universe as a feedback loop, which is going to lead us into some very interesting conversations about the law of attraction. Reenee is going to talk to us about what she calls the Tweety Bird effect. She's also going to tell us about the Noetic Science Organization and the experiences of Dr. Edgar Mitchell and his enlightenment experience that he had while standing on the moon. This was a fascinating conversation. We're also going to talk a little bit about where the soul exists. We're going to talk a little bit about astral projection, near-death experiences, and specifically the near-death experience of Dr. Eben Alexander and how that really changed his life. So right now, sit back, relax, grab yourself a cup of coffee or maybe make some tea, and get ready to listen to part 3 of my conversation with Reenee. The universe would have the consciousness as well because it's made of the same stuff that the trees and the birds and the animals and even this microphone and this computer has some level of consciousness. Now, it may not be to our level, but there is some thought process, some acknowledgement of what it is on its own level in its DNA or the machine code of itself, as you call it.
Right. You know, and now I'm one of those people that see it as something, I'm going to use the term very organic. I think that not only, now this is me talking. So this is just my opinion. And if you see it differently, you know, bless you and carry on. But I see it as very organic and I see it as very intelligent and I see it as running the entire universe. If you were to say, gee, that sounds like kind of like you're coming up with the definition of God, I'm going to say, yeah, for me that works. I believe in a quantum God.
I was just about to say that. Really was.
And then everything starts nesting together. You know, how can you put out the energy to the universe and get anything back? Well, science will tell you everything in the universe works on a feedback loop.
Okay, and this brings us to another great topic that we were talked about off air, which is very popular in the metaphysical community nowadays and ever since the publishing of the book The Secret, which is the law of attraction. And how do you manifest? How do you create? How do you activate that feedback loop?
Well, the first thing that we do wrong, I mean, if you look at, if you ever play with electronics, I'll give you a good example. When you get a new computer, you don't realize it, but somebody sat it in a corner of a warehouse someplace, and they've run your computer for 24 hours straight. They've had it doing something stupid over and over and over again. And they call that burning the machine in. And what they're really doing is they're looking for problems. And what happens is the energy gets sent out through one circuit and back through another. So there's kind of your feedback loop. And it's very simple. And one of the things we do is we try to make it too complicated. And I'll give you an example, because we wanted to move to Florida for years before we actually got to move. We knew that the shuttle program was going to be phased out in California, and if we wanted to keep doing what we were doing, which we both loved, my husband and I, we were going to have to somehow either end up in Houston or end up down here by the Kennedy Space Center. And we decided we wanted to come to Florida. And I was doing all the gyrations, and I wanted to work for this person, and I wanted to do this, and I'm putting out all these absolutes to the universe. And things would start to happen. The person I wanted to work for would call me and say, I don't know why, I've been thinking about you for the last couple of days. How are things? And then, nothing would happen. And so I finally got frustrated with myself, and I decided, okay, I'm going to make this simple. I'm going to make this easy as I can. And if anybody's been to the Kennedy Space Center, we have a great big building called the Vehicle Assembly Building. And it's where they used to stack the shuttles, where they used to stack the Apollo rockets, where they're going to stack the new rockets. And I saw my car parked in front of this huge building in a parking spot, but it was my car and it still had California plates on it. So it wasn't a rental car.
Okay.
I didn't want a business trip down here. I wanted my stuff. I wanted to move here. And I just kept focusing on that, and stuff began to happen.
I think that what you're sharing is extremely important, and it's one of the missing pieces when people talk about the law of attraction, because so many times people think in the book and the movie, The Secret, make it sounds like this, which is one of my big problems with the book and the movie, The Secret, is that all you have to do is walk in front of a jewelry store, close your eyes, and make a wish, and boom, you'll get that diamond necklace.
Right.
It's a lot more involved with that. You have to set your intention, and you have to focus on your intention consistently on that. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and the gentleman used the acronym FOCUS for intention. And what focus means to him is follow one course until success. And
Yep.
I thought that was brilliant.
And see, that's exactly what I did. My car with my California license plates parked in front of this building that was at the Kennedy Space Center. And I would turn around and I would see my car parked there. And now the other thing, and this is the one thing that I have the problem with The Secret. This is the part of the book that was left out. Understand, I wasn't just sitting here or sitting in California going, gee, I wish I lived in Florida. I was making phone calls. I
Yep.
was networking.
Absolutely.
I was finding people that had something interesting to say in Florida, both on the NASA side as well on the side of the company that I would probably work for. And I was reaching out to those people. And I was asking people, do you know of any jobs? Is there any place that I can look? And, this is what we're looking for. And I will tell you what happened. I had moved down here. I'd been at work 4 days. I was summoned. I worked off the Space Center in a building in Cape Canaveral. And I was summoned out at the Space Center to a meeting. And just because I really didn't know Kennedy Space Center that well, here was the VAB, and I parked in front of it. And I walked out in the middle of the street, and I turned around, and there was my car with California license plates parked in front of the VAB. And I almost got hit by a truck because I was just standing there looking at it.
Yep, and I think the lesson there, and this is one that I had to learn very recently, even though I knew all the steps for the law of attraction, is that you have to take action and you have to remain focused on your intent, and you've got to move towards it. In the last couple of weeks, I have been uber focused on this podcast, and I've also been uber focused on my business. Instead of saying, well, I want to do this and I want to have X amount of money and X amount of clients. And every once in a while I would go to a networking meeting, and every once in a while I would reach out to a friend or a buddy or someone I just met. And every once in a while I would dream about the podcast that I was going to have. And a couple of weeks ago I said, no, I'm going to start taking action on this. I'm going to get uber focused on what my mission is, on what I want, and I'm going to start taking the steps. And when you do that, the universe will open like a lotus flower for you.
Yeah.
And in the last couple of weeks, I cannot tell you that since I sat down, got serious, made this announcement on my Facebook page to try and get a few couple of interviews, I have now recorded many, many interviews. I'm having a blast. Reenee, I think you're episode 14 or 15 of this. I've got interviews scheduled after you. I've got people contacting me that I thought I could never reach to do the podcast. My business is starting to take place and focus. I picked up 3 clients in the last 2 weeks. All of them gave me more money than I thought I could ever have, because you have to take the action in addition to having that laser focused intent.
That's what people are missing, is that you want to make the feedback loop something simple that you can see, but then you've got to work your butt off for it. You've got to tell the universe, hey, I'm serious about this.
Yes, and for those of our listeners who may be less scientifically inclined and more metaphysically inclined, I always use the metaphor that the universe is a giant wish fulfillment machine.
Yep.
You send your intentions in forms of thoughts, energy to it, and it's going to return to you whatever you're thinking about, which is in scientific terms, that feedback loop that you were talking about.
Exactly. And to me, that's the most important thing about it. But like I said, the whole thing is a continuum. And if you're so inclined, start to look at some of your experiments as scientific experiments. Write them down. That's the way I start anybody. If I teach tarot, I tell them, pull 3 cards. Take your impression from it, write it down in the morning, and then see what happens during the day.
Well, that brings up the question that I ask everybody when I interview them, and that is, if there's anybody in the audience who's listening to us today that may be at that intersection of science and spirituality and wants to know how to merge that, how to marry those two so they can live their life fully. If there's someone who has the beginnings of psychic energy starting to break through that dam, what advice would you give them to, number one, not be afraid of it so they can get past that programming that we've all had, and number two, how to develop it?
Well, first off, and this is a joke I tell everybody when I start teaching any kind of psychic development, especially tarot, and that is, I always have a few people that hit it, the Tweety Bird effect. The Tweety Bird effect is when you are too good right off the bat, and you like Tweety Bird, you scare your widow self.
Guilty as charged.
Okay, and people will quit. People will say, holy crap, this isn't for me, or, this was the devil talking to me, or any excuse they can come up with so they can quit it. And what you have to do is embrace that moment and say, yes, this is a sign I can do it.
I also want to interject one thing here. As I was developing my psychic ability through reading tarot cards and other meditations and dowsing and saging and the whole 9 yards, and it started to increase and my gifts started to really manifest themselves in everyday life. The scientific part of my mind, because I am a analytical person, I am a Pisces, I live in my head all the time, wanted to know why. It wanted to find out that answer. And I got so caught up in wanting to know why, how I was doing this, specifically what was going on psychologically, spiritually, physically, and emotionally in some cases, that it started to retard my progress because I started focusing more on not the gift itself and developing it, but the process of what was going on. And as an old rabbi of mine said, when I was 12 years old and I had all these questions, esoteric questions, and I went to the library, I went to the rabbi, and I would ask him a question, and he would answer me, and I would ask him another question to get clarification, he would answer me, and we would do this back and forth, and eventually the rabbi looked at me and said, Gary, sometimes you just have to have faith. And that's very similar. I got to the point where I can't explain scientifically or psychologically how I do what I do. I just know that I can do it, and that's now enough. And since I got to that point, it's blown up. And so if our listeners, if anyone is out there, don't get hung up in the minutia of how you're able to do it. Just understand that it's a gift from the universe. It's a gift that the universe gives everybody. You are just in the right place at the right time to tap into it and explore it and play with it.
Well, what I do is and that's where my continuum of quantum physics comes in. I just happen to fall in one of those pockets where, they haven't come up with the right kind of math to figure out how they do it. Now, I will say there are some wonderful books, and I'm going to give you the name of an organization. It's called the Noetic Science Organization, and it's
That's
Noetic. Now, the amazing thing about the Noetic Society, to go back to the science and spirituality, was it was started by one of the astronauts that walked on the moon.
really. Do you know which one?
Yes, it was Dr. Edgar Mitchell, and unfortunately we lost him a couple of years ago. And what was interesting to me was I got to hear Edgar Mitchell speak because he was going out and he was speaking basically to anybody who would listen about what happened to him, because he literally had an enlightenment experience on the moon. When he was on the moon, and again when he was coming back to Earth.
Now, this isn't the same experience that I've heard many astronauts have when they get out into space and they look back on the blue-green marble and they realize, wait a second, we are small and insignificant.
He had the exact opposite. He
Really?
realized he was one with everything.
Okay, I just got chills.
Yeah.
Wow.
And of course, what happened, and what was interesting too, was NASA, and they won't talk about it now, but when he was in flight, both going to and coming back from the moon, they run ESP experiments with him because the man had and recognized his psychic ability.
So why won't NASA talk about that? If they conducted the experiments with an astronaut who seems to be very well respected in the community, why do you think NASA doesn't want to let this information out?
Because a mind will only work if it's open.
Okay, we're going into a little tinfoil hat area, I think.
Yeah, where it was just, okay, this was this guy, and what happened when he came back, because like I said, he twice had this experience of being one with everything, which is a classical Oriental Buddhist, those kind of religions, that's their, that's their moment.
Mm-hmm.
And when he came back to Earth and he started to talk about it, talked about, of course, nothing in the West was ready for him. People ask him, did you see Jesus? Did you see God? And he said, I don't know what I saw. All I know is I am one with everything. And people just shook their head and walked away. And of course, he had to get over to the Eastern religions, like I said, Buddhism and that, to find his answer. Mm-hmm. And he was drummed out of the astronaut corps.
Really? Because of his experience and his change of philosophy?
Yeah. And of course this was 60s, 70s. We were kind of doing a cultural shift then. But they weren't ready to have an astronaut talk about an enlightenment experience. And so what he did, he came back to Earth, and Gary, he did just what you wanted to do, and that's why I'm talking about him. He wanted to figure out what the heck this was, and he was trying to do it in scientific terms. And he started this society, and you go out to the Noetic Society, and there are just tons and tons of papers and information and people that are still trying to experiment and figure out what consciousness is, how this ESP thing works in the realm of consciousness. Is the consciousness separate from the body? You ask a medical doctor and they'll tell you no.
It's interesting you should say that, because my ex-mother-in-law was a nurse at a very well-known hospital in Jacksonville. And she would always tell me about the times where the patient would be on the operating table and either they were close to death or they were just about to pass because they couldn't save them. And if she put her hands, and the other nurses, they did experiments on this, if they put their hands over the patients or as they were working with the patients when they passed, they actually felt something, she called it a soul, push against them and rise up.
Yeah.
That could be your soul, that could be your consciousness. So when you say, is the consciousness separate from the body, I think it's integrated, although if you read the Conversations with God's books, which are fascinating books for anybody to read by Neil Donald Walsh, he talks about the soul and how we all have the idea of the soul being wrong, that we all think the soul is inside of ourselves, when really the soul is the connecting line of energy or aura that connects everyone, that it's on the outside of us, not the inside of us.
And of course, the more esoteric material you read, the more you see that what we consider ourselves is just like a little tiny cocoon of this energy right in the very center. Mm-hmm. And again, the idea is you can reach out and up through this energy. And that is, I'm going to say, traditionally, if you go back and you go through Western mysticism, that's the way it's described.
So do you believe in astral projection?
Yeah. This is terrible to admit. I love astral projection, but I get motion sick so easy that I wake up and I want to throw up.
I don't mean to laugh, but that's one side effect I never thought about. I really didn't.
It's terrible. I remember one time when I was a kid, having a flying dream and getting up and throwing up, and your parents don't appreciate that at 3 a.m.
Okay, so for everyone with motion sickness, if you're going to try astral projection, take 2 Dramamine before you do it.
It's Dramamine. It's definitely Dramamine. And, I have, needless to say, a lot of my friends that I end up palling around with are heavy into this stuff because, it's the only way we make sense of the world. And I have friends that can astrally project readily. And I had one girlfriend who, and it was funny because I dreamed of her, and she said to me the next day at work, "Why didn't you come out and play?" And she had astrally projected into my dreams, and she wanted me to go someplace with her. And like I said, the Dramamine queen said, "Well, I'm not going to get up and throw up at 5 a.m. and wouldn't go."
Now, I think, I can't be sure, but I think, and I'd like your opinion on this, I had an astral projection or a body leaving experience once. When I was 22 years old, I was hit by a car crossing the Sunrise Highway, racing for a train to get to work. And in my mind, I remember being, looking down on the accident. I remember looking at the people on the platform boarding the train and thinking to myself, "Welp, I'm never going to make it to work." And for years and years, I mean, I'm talking 20 years, 25 years, I always thought that I was hit by the car and I was just thrown that far up in the air. When I came back from Florida and I moved back to New York, the first time I drove past that intersection, and must have been 30 years, I sort of looked up and I realized the platform was a good 20 feet off the ground.
Yeah.
And I realized that there is no way I could have physically been thrown 20 feet up in the ground and then come down and hit the ground again and probably still be alive. So the only explanation I have is that my soul, my consciousness, my being temporarily left my body.
You had a near-death experience. And, I guarantee you what you described is exactly, it's a classic near-death experience. So, yeah, it's a rough way to have an astral projection. It's much better, if you can work through it and leave and decide to come back. But you had the experience. And so, I will say...
Have you ever had an NDE experience?
No.
Okay.
Luckily, knock wood, that's one thing that's passed me.
Now, my mother had a near-death experience. While we're on the subject, I just want to share this with our listeners, where I think she was going in for gallbladder surgery, and she was on the operating table, and she had this vision of walking down a dark tunnel.
Okay.
Your classic dark tunnel, where she was walking with a man who was taller than her, dressed all in white and glowing.
Okay.
And she was walking towards the end of the tunnel, and she felt the sunshine in the tunnel, and there were flowers and butterflies, and her mother and her father were there, my grandma and grandfather, and her relatives who had passed were there, and they got to the end of the tunnel, and she knew if she stepped foot over the tunnel to the other side, she wasn't going to be able to come back.
Right.
And her guide turned to her and said, "Lynn, you're not ready yet. There's still stuff you need to do." And at that moment, she heard the nurse say, "We got her. She's stable. Close her up."
And that's that again, very, very, very common. I was going to ask you if you had even seen a tunnel when you were thrown out of the car.
No, I literally just saw the train platform, and my mind went, "Shit, I'm not making work this today."
Yeah. Okay. And and that's it. There are different near-death experiences, but a lot of them have exactly the same characteristics in them, and the same parts of it that make it up. So like, had you continued, you would have gotten to the part with the tunnel and a guide and being shown, the grass and everything, and either told, "Hey, Garrett, you got a lot to do, we'll talk to you later," or it would have been, "Whoops, guy, you're kind of young, but that car hit you kind of hard, and, welcome to paradise."
Well, okay, I got two questions here, and I don't know which one I want to ask, so I don't know where I'm going to start. But do you think that experience of the tunnel and the sunshine and the grass and the beauty and the people who meet you there, is that an individual situation? Meaning, if somebody's idea of heaven is not grass and warmth, do you think they see something else? Do you think that vision is different for everyone?
I'm not going to say it's different for everyone. I think a lot of it is the way you're conditioned. There is, and I wish I could remember his name, and I'll have to give it to you so you can, put it in the notes for this interview. But there was a man, he was a neurosurgeon, and he got meningitis. And he ended up in a medically induced coma, and he was literally hanging by a thread. He was a thread away from death. And what he saw was a butterfly that just took him all over places. He went out in the stars and he just kind of floated around. So he didn't have the tunnel, he didn't have his parents, and really he wasn't dead, but he was so close to death that it wasn't funny. And the thing that was most astounding about it was he had lost a sister before he was born. And his parents had decided they never were going to traumatize this child by talking about his sister. And they had kept all the pictures and everything away from him about this sister. And she'd been a great deal older than him. And finally, when all of this had happened to him, by the way, he survives. They bring him out of the coma. He's fine. He can remember everything. And he's just trying to describe this to people. So they finally found him first a psychologist who said, "Okay, you're crazy." And then they found a couple of psychologists who said, "No, wait a minute, he's had a near-death experience." And they went and talked to him. And come to find out, the face of this butterfly turned out to be the face of the sister that had died.
Wow.
So here's somebody who, like I said, had no idea of what heaven was like, and so he just drifted through the whole universe, which is fine with me. And of course, there are the books, and you can find them both in the New Age as well as the Christian section where people went to hell.
When you said books, and I wasn't going to go to the hell, but if our listeners want to learn more about past lives and near-death experiences, specifically past lives, and it's going to bring up the second question. There's a wonderful book out there by Dr. Brian K. Weiss, changed my life, called Many Lives, Many Masters.
Yep.
I highly recommend it to anyone who is curious about near-death experiences and especially past lives. Wow. These hits just keep on coming. Reenee is fascinating. I love talking with her. These conversations go all over the place, and I hope you are enjoying it. I love the fact that she doesn't want to astral project because she gets motion sickness. That was great. The story she told about her car and visualizing her car in the front of the Kennedy Space Center and then turning around and actually seeing it there was wonderful. And the enlightenment experience of Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut who felt that while he was on the moon, he was connected with everything, was just fascinating to hear, and I can't wait to do some more research on that. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for this episode of Passionate Talk. I hope you're enjoying my conversations with Reenee. Part 4 will be coming up on our next episode on Wednesday, so please keep an ear out and an eye out for it. And until then, follow your dreams and passions, and manifest the life that you choose.